Hello everyone, and welcome to a preliminary discussion about what has been happening in Russia over the past few days. There will no doubt be more to discuss as the dust settles and we start to get more information on the details and maneuverings that actually happened. But it's been about a day, so this is as good a time as any to take a first look at it and start breaking it down. So the first big question, is this the biggest threat to Putin's regime in the time that he has been in power? And the answer is yes, but not in the way that you might think. In theory, yes, Wagner could have taken Moscow, could have taken the Kremlin, could have deposed Putin, but really, it wasn't in the cards, it was not going to happen. But look at this happening and understand that the context of Putin's regime is such that his power and his legitimacy, more than his power, depends heavily on being able to guarantee and provide stability. That has been continually unraveling since the beginning of the war, and particularly since the mobilization in September. This is probably the most serious breach of this guarantee that we have seen. Beyond the mobilization, this is substantially worse, I think, and less possible to mitigate with media and different manipulations. Now, happily casting aside Ilyin and Dugin, I think the most useful philosopher for understanding modern Russia that most people are familiar with is Thomas Hobbes, and I want to quote him here: "The obligations of the subjects to the sovereign are understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasts by which he is able to protect them." So if you understand the modern Russian political situation as a kind of Hobbesian bargain between the populace and Putin, stability in exchange for corruption and autocracy, then we are looking at increasing violations of that bargain that Putin has lost control over. We've got the mobilization, which could be kind of seen through the lens of this bargain and could be considered a part of it, but a lot of Russians still were not happy about it. Then you've got these incursions in Belgorod, drone strikes in Moscow, and now you have rogue mercenaries roving through the border provinces. This is really not a good look, this is not stable, and this is not really what Putin had promised. So in a way, Putin is less legitimate, both within his elite and within the eyes of the Russian population, than he was before this happened. And that part is important, the elite part. He has now allowed something very dangerous and very disruptive to happen that a lot of his people were actively concerned about and wanted to take steps to prevent. A lot of people within the administration, presidential administration, within the security services, particularly within the Ministry of Defense and the military, Shoigu and Gerasimov obviously are not any friends of Prigozhin, have been pushing against this rogue, or at times not even rogue, but out of control element, and Putin neglected to do anything about it until it reached essentially a boiling point. And that is not a good look for him in the eyes of the people that he depends on to maintain his power. So we know that the military and the Ministry of Defense were skeptical of Prigozhin and wanted to get rid of him. How about the presidential administration? They did not like him, but according to sources from Medusa, the people within the presidential administration thought that the risk of an armed insurrection or revolt was essentially zero. Now, Putin was acting against Prigozhin before this. There was the contracts with the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense announced that any volunteer formations, including private military companies, would have to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense and become state contractors to continue operating in Ukraine. Now, Putin, a few days after, agreed with this and said that it would have to be done. This was definitely a move against Prigozhin. This cannot be ignored because he would be the main sufferer from this, and it was a clear move to subordinate him to the Ministry of Defense and potentially deprive him of any control over his forces. Was this because Putin was worried about a military coup? Probably not. Most likely, he thought that Prigozhin's antics and temper tantrums were getting in the way of the war, and infighting between the Ministry of Defense and Wagner was no longer advantageous because it was getting in the way of a victory. Beyond that, Prigozhin has become increasingly an anti-state actor and both rebellious against and defiant of the state, even if not directly rebellious against Putin. And Putin is at his core a statist, so this was, to some degree, intolerable. To have a military force inside what he considers to be Russia's borders, heavily armed, and loyal perhaps to him and perhaps to Russia, but not to the state. This was intolerable. So, after letting the conflict between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense fester for months, Putin finally came down very decisively on the side of Shoigu and Gerasimov. And Prigozhin revolted against this, and in his communications became increasingly aggressive and belligerent, which is, in many ways, it looks like, throwing a tantrum to try and get Putin's attention and communicate what he saw as the seriousness of the situation. The degree to which Putin was aware of this is uncertain. If Prigozhin really wanted to communicate effectively, he probably shouldn't have used the internet and Telegram, because we do know that Putin does not use the internet or Telegram, but it's possible he was informed about this by the defense ministry, by somebody in his administration, or by somebody in the security services, because there are a lot of people who would like to see Prigozhin knocked down a few notches. And because Prigozhin is largely isolated and has no friends within the existing infrastructure, once Putin decided that he was no longer valued or useful, he was essentially left without any recourse except either giving up and going away quietly, or this. So to comment on language, this wouldn't really be a coup. This is closer to an armed insurrection or an armed rebellion, or even a selective mutiny within the armed forces, because Wagner is interesting in that it is very heavily and completely tied into the state infrastructure while still maintaining some level of independence. So if it had happened in Moscow and it had been a quick strike at the center of power, that would have been a coup. That wasn't really what we saw. This was a rebellion by armed forces who came from the front and returned with the goal of moving into Russia and potentially into Moscow. So what actually happened? On June 23rd, Prigozhin accused the Russian military at the direction of the Ministry of Defense of firing a rocket at a Wagner camp and killing a larger number of Wagner soldiers. Here is a commentary from Prigozhin on this. They deceived us despicably and tried to deprive us of the possibility of defending our homes. We were ready to make concessions to the defense ministry, to surrender our weapons, and to find a solution about how we'll continue to defend our country. But that scum wouldn't accept it. Today, seeing that we aren't broken, they decided to launch rocket attacks on our camps. Soon after this, we got the first videos of Wagner soldiers marching into the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, which is on the Ukrainian border, where the regional headquarters of the Russian Ministry of Defense is located, which is responsible for the war in Ukraine. There were videos of Russian soldiers, Wagner soldiers, in the city, tanks driving down the streets, and a video reportedly showing Wagner forces surrounding the regional military headquarters. Outside of Rostov-on-Don, a Russian military helicopter is shot down by Wagner. Soon after, a video was published showing negotiations or discussion between Prigozhin and, in Rostov-on-Don, Deputy Defense Minister Yevkurov and Deputy Chief of Staff Alexeyev. Prigozhin expresses an interest in capturing Shoigu and Gerasimov, calls them senile clowns, as well as the two he's speaking to, and the Deputy Defense Minister and Chief of Staff ask him to withdraw his troops from the city. He refuses. The Deputy Chief of Staff complains about how the Ukrainians will be celebrating this for 3 days in Kiev, and Prigozhin responds by saying that when they had withdrawn from Izyum, when they had abandoned Krasny-Liman, or when the front around Kiev had collapsed, the Ukrainians had been celebrating for at least a week, and accuses them of personal failure in military command in Ukraine. The video ends with Prigozhin saying, quote, "We are saving Russia." The FSB opened a criminal case against Prigozhin for incitement to armed rebellion. And at around the same time, Prigozhin says that what he is doing is not a military coup, but a march of justice. Wagner soldiers are reported to have also taken the Voronezh city and region, which is directly north of Rostov region, Wagner soldiers begin moving in the direction of Moscow with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and various anti-aircraft weapons. There are reports of Putin fleeing the capital, which are as yet unconfirmed. There are also confirmed reports of some high-ranking officials and functionaries taking their families out of the capital city. The governor of Rostov region told citizens to not go out late, not go out when not necessary, and to stay away from the city center of Rostov-on-Don. According to sources in Meduza, at this point the Kremlin was attempting to conduct negotiations with Prigozhin and instructed regional governors to refrain from personally condemning or strongly, harshly speaking about Prigozhin when they were discussing what was going on. These negotiations reportedly did not go well, and an amendment of instructions went out for regional governors to begin decrying Prigozhin as a traitor. Sergei Surovikin, who was long seen by Prigozhin as an ally within the Ministry of Defense and was actually removed from a command over his ties to Prigozhin, was instructing the Wagner mercenaries to stand down and asking Wagner mercenaries who hadn't already taken part in the insurrection and Russian soldiers to stay loyal to the president. Prigozhin gave a statement saying that it was wrong to call them traitors, that they were patriots and they were going to save their homeland, and saying that they would not surrender or turn themselves in to anyone, whether by order of the FSB or even by the president. Prigozhin claimed that half the army was ready to support him, and some sources reported different divisions. I believe I heard the 22nd Division were saying that these sections of the Russian army had already defected to Prigozhin's cause, but this never really happened or turned out, and we never saw any serious evidence of it. As Prigozhin's forces are reaching the outskirts of Moscow and the first line of prepared defenses, he calls Putin. He tries to contact the Kremlin. Putin will not speak to him. Putin gives a speech condemning the revolt in the strongest words, calling it a stab in the back and a threat to Russian statehood, a betrayal of the country and the soldiers on the front, although notably he does not refer to Prigozhin by name. He promises to hold all traitors accountable and encourages those who are being swept up in the revolt or who are the Prigozhin and Wagnerites are trying to recruit. He urges them not to take up arms against their country and lists personal ambition as the cause of the revolt. A counter-terrorist state of emergency is declared in Moscow. We see videos of roads being dug up, fortifications being prepared outside the city. We see videos supposedly of Kadyrov's Chechen fighters in Rostov preparing to launch an attack on Wagner from behind. Then, with the Wagner soldiers less than 100 kilometers from Moscow, reportedly, Prigozhin announces an end to the rebellion and says that they are turning back. There are videos soon after of Wagner troops leaving Rostov-on-Don and other areas that they had occupied. It is reported that negotiations had been conducted between Prigozhin and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, and that Prigozhin had agreed to withdraw, and according to spokesman Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, criminal charges against Prigozhin would be dropped by the FSB and he would leave the country for Belarus. It is announced also by Peskov that Wagner soldiers who hadn't taken part in the mutiny would be incorporated into the Ministry of Defense somehow, and there has been talk of pardoning Wagner soldiers who did take part. Reportedly, the negotiations were conducted not only by Lukashenko, but also by the Russian ambassador to Belarus, by the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, and by the Chief of Staff for the Presidential Administration. So, why Lukashenko? Apparently, reportedly, because Prigozhin was not willing to be seen giving into and negotiating with lower-ranking officials, and Putin was refusing to see or talk to him, so Lukashenko was found by high-ranking officials in the Russian government and by Prigozhin as a head of state who would agree to talk to Prigozhin as a suitable substitute and intermediary. So, Prigozhin began the rebellion because he felt he was threatened and he was about to lose his standing within the political system, along with the physical force that guarantees his life. Why did he give up? Why did he roll over instead of continuing his march into Moscow? There are a few reasons. First of all, numbers, chance of success. He was very much outnumbered. There are not only military units in Moscow, which are to some degree depleted, There's also a large volume of FSB people, of Rosgvardia, and various internal security units, probably some SVR personnel. There are large numbers of forces under control of the president and hostile to Prigozhin that are stationed in Moscow. So without substantial defections, his chances of success were fairly low. He had, according to himself at the start, 25,000 men. That is not a very large number in the grand scheme of things, and it's even less when you consider that not every single one of those 25,000 is going to be on the road to Moscow, because that would be unsustainable and it would leave him very vulnerable. And we can see from the videos that he still has people and tanks, at the very least, in Rostov-on-Don. So he was very much outnumbered, and even if the Wagner troops might have been per person superior to FSB troops or internal ministry troops, just the numbers would be very overwhelming, and it would deplete him. It would probably be a losing battle, and it would probably accomplish nothing. So that's one thing. The second reason, which ties into the first, is that he almost certainly expected large-scale defections from the military, which would balance this out and force the government to, if not give him everything he wanted, then make substantial concessions, and would put him in a very advantageous position. But this did not happen. There were no large-scale defections that we have seen. There were some soldiers and some cases of military outposts or checkpoints allowing them through without a fight, not presenting arms, but there was no case that we saw of real violence that was backed up by the army against the government. We did see, I believe, 13 confirmed dead over the course of this, mostly in helicopter shoot-downs and aircraft attacks. There may be more that are not yet confirmed. The third reason was Putin's speech. Putin had condemned his revolt and condemned him as a traitor, and he may have hoped that Putin would make concessions or even that Putin would take his side. It's not necessarily something he believed, but he may have hoped that would have happened. It became clear that not only would that not happen, but that Putin was firmly and completely siding with the Ministry of Defense, and if Putin did, then the security services certainly would. So left him isolated and without allies. He was outgunned. He was in a very bad position. So what was he going to do? He was outside Moscow. He was maybe 100 kilometers away. When you reach Moscow, after you've been marching, what do? You march on the Kremlin, right? And that is something that you cannot take back. Once you have attempted to remove Putin with force of arms, if you fail, then excuse my French, if you fail, you're fucked. That is the end of your political career and almost certainly your life. So Prigozhin may have decided that this gamble was not worth it. And is that a good decision? I'd say no. I wouldn't want to be him right now if I was him. I would be very concerned for the continuing of my existence. Maybe he'll go to Belarus for a few months, and maybe he'll live happily and die in retirement there, or maybe he'll die a lot sooner, or maybe once things have been stabilized and the regular army has found a way to bring back heavy units without the front collapsing in Ukraine, they will simply crush Wagner and any remaining forces. There are a lot of things that they could do. They could send an assassin after Prigozhin, and there's really not a lot of recourse that he has if he's fleeing to Belarus and giving up control of his army. Whatever the Kremlin decides to do, and they may not do anything, but whatever they decide to do, he can't really stop them anymore. He has given up his guarantee of safety. So he's kind of got the worst of both worlds. If he had continued, if he had marched on the Kremlin, he probably would have failed. He probably would have died. But there was, a chance that he could have succeeded, and then he would have been a lot safer. And if he hadn't done any of this, then maybe he would have lost substantial control over Wagner. But again, he would still be safe and alive, and it wouldn't have been great, but it would be a better outcome than what he got. So this was, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, the worst of all worlds. So say everything had gone right for Prigozhin, and he had gotten everything he wanted. How would that have looked like? Would it have been a civil war? No, definitely not. Would it have been Putin being removed from power and Prigozhin taking his place, or appointing somebody in his place? Probably not either. We'd see something likely Shoigu and Gerasimov being removed, the defense ministry position maybe being filled by Prigozhin or somebody he chose, and the chief of staff position potentially going to an ally or perceived ally like Sergei Surovikin. And of course, the idea of Wagner signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense would go out the window. He would also likely push for concessions in the economic sphere in terms of militarization of the economy and an increase in state control over production. At points in the war, he's talked about how North Korea might be a good point for emulation in terms of their being cut off from the outside world and choosing to exist in their own kind of separated bubble that isn't so vulnerable to subversion from outside, and with their entire economy turned towards production and militarization. So overall, both Putin and Prigozhin come out of this not doing so well, but Putin is substantially less damaged than Prigozhin. Prigozhin is essentially finished as a political actor. He's done. He's more or less out of the game in any serious capacity, even if he survives this whole catastrophe. We are, of course, going to have to talk about this more in the future because it is very significant and very interesting, and we are going to get more details as the dust settles. But this has been a preliminary discussion of the armed insurrection in Russia, and thank you very much for listening.